Welcome to the final event in our Voices of Our Time speaker series for the 2011-2012 academic year. Voices of Our Time is designed to bring the world's leading thinkers to campus to discuss the important national and international issues of our time. Wake Forest believes that providing access to world-class speakers is part of a student's global education, as well as our commitment to the community beyond our campus. This week marks the beginning of a two-year agreement between Wake Forest, High Point University, and Guilford College, and the Washington, D.C.-based Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, which will bring top foreign correspondents to the Triad twice a year. The Pulitzer Center's Campus Consortium is a growing network of more than a dozen colleges and universities aimed at raising awareness of systemic international concerns that are often unreported in the U.S. media. Our program this evening, Too Young to Wed, Uncovering the Secret World of Child Brides in the Middle East, Asia, and Africa, is a powerful example of that commitment. The photography of Stephanie Sinclair and the reporting of our guest Cynthia Gorney were featured in National Geographic last June in a story that attracted worldwide attention and acclaim. Thus, the mission of the Pulitzer Center is a strategic fit with Wake Forest's goal of educating students to be citizens of the world. I want to thank Justin Catanoso, Senior Lecturer, and our new Director of Journalism here at Wake Forest for making our relationship with the Pulitzer Center, as well as this event, possible. Justin is a professional print and broadcast journalist with 30 years of experience. He was the founding executive editor of the Business Journal in the Triad, which he led for 13 years. Pulitzer Prize nominee, Justin's writings have appeared in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Business Week, and National Public Radio. I invite Justin to the podium now to give a detailed introduction of tonight's program and speakers. Justin.
Wow, full house. This is really great. Thank you all for coming. Dr. Hatch, thank you very much for hosting this and making it a Voices of Our Times event. What is the purpose of modern journalism? It's a question that I wrestle with a lot, and it's no secret that the traditional business of daily newspapers and weekly news magazines are in serious trouble. We don't need to see any more reporters or editors lose their jobs or publications to fold to help us understand that. We know it already. But if traditional media is in decline, new media is in ascension, right? Right now, some exceptional traditional journalists have found new homes at places like the Huffington Post, Business Insider, Gawker, and BuzzFeed. Some real reporting is taking place on those sites in ways that just wasn't happening a few years ago. But it can be awfully hard to find those stories amid the sensational summaries, the celebrity gossip, and the talking dog videos. So I have to admit, I loved the talking dog video. I mean, I watched it like 100 times. But is this the purpose of modern journalism? Is this the future? Well, the legendary publisher Joseph Pulitzer once said, "We will illuminate dark places and with a deep sense of responsibility interpret these troubled times." Is modern journalism still capable of doing that? So I don't know if I had a good answer to those questions until I went to Washington, D.C. last spring and visited the offices of the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. Well, this journalism nonprofit was more than 5 years old. I had never heard of it or knew anything about its work. But as I sat in their offices and learned about their mission to support the cause of overseas reporting, I felt two things not often associated with traditional news these days: excitement and hope. I felt like I was getting a glimpse, however narrow, of the future of journalism. And when I heard about this thing the Pulitzer Center promotes called the Campus Consortium, whereby it partners with colleges and universities across the country to raise the visibility of its fundamental mission, I knew immediately that I wanted Wake Forest and the journalism program to be a part of it. As luck will have it, John Sawyer, a longtime foreign correspondent and the visionary behind the Pulitzer Center, is a Winston-Salem native. He has a great affinity for this place and for this campus. And with his guidance and the support of Klein Harrison in the Provost's Office on Global Affairs, Wake Forest has joined this consortium, as Dr. Hatch just said. To make this a regional effort here in the Triad, High Point University and Guilford College has joined us as well. And that's why we're here. We have a powerful program for you this evening, one that is as timely as it is topical. Basic human rights for girls and women in countries across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Girls, children really, who are too young to wed, but must do so anyway. To share this story with us, we are fortunate to have Cynthia Gorney of National Geographic magazine. Cynthia has long been and continues to be one of the finest journalists in America. In the work that she does now, she and the Pulitzer Center are helping to redefine the purpose of modern journalism. And in that, there is hope for the future of this vitally important profession. Now I'd like to invite John Sawyer to the stage to further introduce Cynthia in our program. John?
Thank you, Justin, and President Hatch, and all of you for being here tonight. It's a thrill for me to be at Wake Forest, which has been such an important part of my family's life. Justin didn't mention that my dad, Glenn Sawyer, spent his entire career at the medical school. Lucille and Carl Harris, my aunt and uncle, were mainstays of the music and classics department on this campus from the year this campus opened in 1955. I'm so pleased that Lucille and my mother, Betsy Sawyer, could both be here tonight. Thanks to Justin for making Wake Forest the newest member of the Pulitzer Center's Campus Consortium, and for the brilliant idea of creating this consortium within a consortium by bringing in High Point and Guilford as well. We think our college and secondary program of school educational outreach is among the most important aspects of our work, bringing our journalists into the classroom to share their work and giving students at participating universities the opportunity for travel reporting fellowships with us. And we had a chance yesterday to meet with the applicants for the first Pulitzer Student Travel Fellows from Wake Forest, and it's a very impressive group of students and project proposals. The Pulitzer Center has become an important venue for international journalism and for public engagement with big global issues, thanks to collaborations with college partners like Wake Forest, and also with a wide range of news media outlets, from PBS NewsHour and the Washington Post to Foreign Policy and NPR. One of our most important relationships is with the National Geographic on issues ranging from water and sanitation to population. We became involved in this project last spring, shortly before Cynthia and Stephanie's article was published. Stephanie came to us looking for help to make a multimedia version of the project, something that would capture not only her photographs, but also the voices of child brides themselves. A month ago, we learned that Stephanie's multimedia work had won second place in the 2012 Pictures of the Year International Photojournalism Contest. Her photographs for the project won a first place prize from World Press Photo. And just today, the National Magazine Awards announced that Stephanie's photographs from this article are finalists for this year's prize in documentary photography. But as welcome as that recognition is, even more important is the response from readers of the magazine article, viewers of the video, and the audiences with whom we've had a chance to share this work. Stephanie had very much wanted to be here tonight. She is in Yemen, again on assignment for National Geographic, and was not able to exit the country in time. We are fortunate to have her video and her voice to introduce this topic. We're even more fortunate to have her partner, Cynthia Gorney, to lead us through the journey they took together through the troubling and complex challenges faced by the estimated 25,000 girls and young women each day who were wed before the age of 18. Stephanie began her career at the Chicago Tribune, where she was part of a reporting team that won the Pulitzer Prize. She then freelanced in the Middle East, working in conflict zones in Afghanistan and Iraq and beyond. She has worked on this project for 8 years plus, from Yemen, India, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, and more. She's a graduate of the University of Florida and is represented by the 7 Photo Agency. Cynthia Gorney is a former Washington Post features writer and foreign correspondent who since 1999 has taught at the University of California, Berkeley School of Journalism. She is the author of what I consider one of the best journalism books of the last 25 years, Articles of Faith, A History of the Abortion Wars, a book marked by the same extraordinary blend of fearless reporting and deep empathy that characterize the work she and Stephanie have done on child brides. So it's a great honor for me to be here, for us to be here, and we so much appreciate your interest. And with that, let me turn the podium to Cynthia.
Thank you both, all three, for those wonderful introductions. I want you to make me disappear for a moment, because what I want to do before the film comes for a couple of minutes is try to the extent possible to turn myself into Stephanie, who would love to have been able to be here. It is her absolute, fearless, gritty determination to get every image possible, no matter how hard that is and how long you have to wait, that kept her in Yemen and brought this project to fruition. So turn me into about 20 years younger with red hair, tough, and what Stephanie would tell you, because I've done this with her a time or two before, is that this issue came to her attention, as John mentioned, nearly a decade ago, when she was sent out on an assignment which involved young women who were very severely burned in Afghanistan. They were in hospital wards, and they had apparently burned themselves. Took a great deal of work, a great deal of patience to learn this, and as Stephanie began getting to know these women and taking these extraordinarily powerful photographs of the women with their severe burns, sometimes under veils, sometimes with the veils partly lifted, she began asking about some of the factors that would lead a woman to this kind of self-immolation. Child marriage, forced marriage, being sold into marriage began to be part of the story that was told. And Stephanie is the one who made this project happen, who brought the film that you're about to see to fruition, and who doggedly persuaded the National Geographic, as great a magazine as Geographic is, that a topic this dark potentially and this distressing belonged in its pages. And I was brought in once Stephanie had already persuaded them to do that, and working with her was a fantastic experience. She's a difficult person. She doesn't stop until she gets the image that she needs. She gets really mad when people who are trying to help her don't do their very, very best. And once we learned how to work with each other, she became an absolutely unforgettable partner, and I hope very much to get a chance to work with her again. So I want you to have that image of this person and her dedication as this film begins, and then when it's done, I'll talk to you about our experience of reporting the story together. Go ahead.
During sex, I was crying and begging him to stop, but he didn't listen. Then he put his hand on my mouth like this. I couldn't breathe, and I was crying, but he used me anyway. And I just cried. My age is 8.
The practice of child marriage is common in many parts of the world. It's not exclusive to any particular religion or society. Despite laws that forbid it, long-held cultural traditions die hard. If the current trend continues, more than 100 million more young girls will be married over the next decade.
They were decorating my hands with nugs, but I didn't know they were going to marry me off. Then my mother came in and said, "Come on, my daughter." They were dressing me up and I was asking, "Where are you taking me?" They just said, "Come, come," and then they performed the wedding.
Child marriage occurs in more than 50 developing countries around the world, and almost always results in the girl's removal from school. What families don't realize is that by curtailing girls' education, they're only perpetuating the cycle of poverty. Still, families do this for a number of reasons. Perhaps they can't afford to feed the rest of their children. It can create family alliances, and it often settles debts. Early marriage often results in abusive and even deadly consequences. As one Afghan policewoman told me, girls are routinely seen as family burdens, while their male counterparts are seen as kings. She was later murdered by the Taliban.
I was 7, 8 when I was engaged. My father and his father, they wanted to exchange their children. That time I thought of committing suicide.
I was married when I was 7 years old. I always say God is punishing me for something.
One of the reasons that child marriage continues to prevail is the husband's family and the husband think that when they bring a girl into the family when she's so young, they can mold her to be exactly what they want her to be. And there is this sense that somehow the man is raising this child as his wife.
A good wife should be respectful of the groom's family because she's now going to live with them. We don't call a woman beautiful by her looks, but by how nicely she takes care of her house and her husband.
He was trying to have sex with me, and I was crying, and I kept struggling to free myself from him. He mocked me, saying, "Where are you going to go?" Then he used me.
I was a woman exchanged for someone else's wrongdoing. My father-in-law and my husband, they were all with the Taliban. My father-in-law took me out of the house to a mountain. I thought they would kill me or behead me. I did not think he would cut my nose and my ears. The blood came over my eyes. I didn't know where the blood was coming from.
My friends were not getting married, and it was only me, so I didn't like that. So when I saw my parents preparing the feast, I knew they were definitely going to give me to a husband. So I escaped. I was about 14. The person who gave me a ride, he raped me while we were on our way here. So I was devastated. I regret coming here, and I wish I had stayed with my family because the person who raped me didn't use a condom. And he introduced me to a broker who got me this job as a prostitute. After 15 days, I found out I was pregnant. I started getting sick. I struggled as much as I could and worked as a prostitute until I was 9 months pregnant.
In some cultures, there's this myth that by marrying young virgins, AIDS will be cured. Many times they start having sex immediately because they have no control over the situation. The husband is the one who rules. Older men who have sex with younger girls tend to have sex more frequently.
I don't know how children are made, but they get pregnant and they deliver a baby. They carry it inside their stomach. Then they deliver and it comes out a baby.
I didn't want to get pregnant because I was very small. I wanted to wait until I am old enough.
Is she worried that she won't make it through the birth?
Sometimes I think I will die.
Was she hopeful for any help, or was she worried about her future?
I have never got help from anywhere until now. I don't know anyone who will help me.
The good news is that rates of child marriage are going down. The problem is we don't want to wait 50 or 100 years for child marriage to disappear. We're talking about 100 million girls who will get married as children over the next decade. We want the change to occur faster.
We were studying when my mother was still alive, but then she passed away and they don't allow me to go to school.
Education is the single largest protective factor against child marriage. Girls don't want to be child brides. Childhood is not for cooking, cleaning, and having babies. It's for education and having friends and having fun.
I pray that we will have better opportunities in the future. I pray that I'll be free from HIV when I'm tested. I also pray that the men who were very rude, who beat us, who use knives and guns to threaten us, that we will not have these men in our lives. I pray.
So what I'm going to do now is try to put some of those images into context for you by telling you some stories. The first thing I want you to understand is that when I was first called in on this project, which was some years ago now, I guess it was 2009 when we did our main reporting. It took a long time to pull this together. My editor called and said, you know, we know that you like complicated stories. Your big work was on abortion, which is a very, of course, complex thing. And so we want you to do this very complex issue, child marriage. And I said, there's nothing complicated about child marriage. Those people should all be shot. This is very easy. I don't understand what you want me to do. And she said, we think that when you've started learning about it a little bit, just wait and see. So of course she was utterly right. When I began learning about the worldwide problem, which I want to stress is not related to any particular religious faith. The girls that you saw in that video are of the Christian faith, of the Hindu faith, of the Muslim faith. They do all come from traditional societies, but these societies have roots all over the world. And when I began learning about the circumstances around these girls' lives and how very complex and multiple the hazards are against them, I began to see what my editor was talking about. We decided, Stephanie did reporting with her photography on this in multiple countries, including Ethiopia, Afghanistan, Iraq, India, and Yemen. My field work was in North India, where I went twice, and in Yemen, where I spent some time. And what I would like to do is sort of talk you through some of the stories that we walked into as a way of helping you understand how very complicated it is to try to take apart the wrongs being done to these girls and isolate them from just the part that seems the most shocking to us, which is the notion of a young child being forced to marry and immediately our minds go to have sex with a man old enough to be her grandfather. That is certainly part of this problem, but honestly, it is one very small part, and there are so many other parts. So if you'll bring up the first slide, please. This child's name is Rajni. She's 5. She lives, or lived at the time that we were there, in a village in the North Indian state of Rajasthan, which we chose to go to because although marriage of girls under 18 takes place all over India, and I want to stress it is illegal all over India and has been for 100 years, it is a very traditional practice, and Rajasthan in the north, which is a very traditional state in India, is one of the places of the highest concentration of child marriage. We chose to go there during a particular season called Akatij, which is a time of auspicious beginnings for all kinds of things in that region. It's good for starting businesses, and many weddings take place in Akatij because that's a feeling about that time. And so we looked for these circumstances there. We heard about, some weeks into our work together there, we were in a small city in Rajasthan, and through word of mouth, which is how we found all of this stuff, we heard about someone who was in a village about an hour away, and we were told was going to marry off his 2 underaged granddaughters. I beg your pardon, his 2 underage daughters, who we were told were about 15 and about 13. Did we want to go? Yes, of course, we said we wanted to go. When we got there, Indian weddings are multi-day events, particularly in the small villages where a wedding is the biggest deal that takes place in any community. And when we got there, this child was one of the kids that we met. We noted her. That's all there was. Ritual bathing, which is a thing that takes place before the marriages in these communities, started to happen along with many other ceremonials. We could see that there were chairs being set up all over the place. There were giant, beautiful canopies made of saris that had been hung together. There were big, open chests to hold the presents that people had brought and the dowry presents that would be given, which were the gifts given from the girl's family to the family of the husband. Also illegal in India, happens all the time anyway. This is one of the girls. This is outdoors. They set up a sort of a curtain you can see around here made from the saris that they're holding up. and the girls bathe, and around them, I want you to try to imagine the women of the village are singing in the Rajasthani language, a song that, to my ear anyway, sounds incredibly mournful. I didn't get anybody to translate the words of the song to me because there was too much going on at the time, but it was a traditional song for sending a young bride or any bride off to her ceremony. Then, next slide, Rajni is being bathed too. And this was one of the times when we began to realize that although this is not what we had been told, she was going to be one of the 3 brides at this ceremony. Now, the reason that they're very secretive about all of this is, as I said, child marriage is illegal in India. Gandhi, interestingly, although his wife was only, I believe, 11 when they married, campaigned against it, and Indian law has prohibited marriage under 18 for girls for a long time. Once in a while, not often, police will come and break up a wedding, which not only can result in the family being put in jail, but perhaps even more dreadful for the family, brings that family into shame for a very long time. So these marriages are kept very quiet, and as though a 5-year-old girl was going to understand the concept of her being married anyway, it is common practice not to tell the girl, as with that young girl's voice, the Afghan girl that you heard in the film, not to tell the girl what's happening until just before it occurs. So it was pretty clear to us that Rajni had no idea, not only, of course, what marriage was, but that she was going to be part of all of these festivities that involved the 2 older girls, who, for complex familiar reasons, were actually her aunts. But they all lived together in this one little village. This is when our hearts really began to fall through our shoes, watching this. This, as you saw from the video, this is one of the girls. They're in a little house right now. I want you to imagine this is part of a room. It's very hot. And crammed into this room are a whole bunch of women, all helping these young girls with their makeup and their grooming for this big ceremony that is going to occur late into the night. Here's Rajni, about to be turned into someone's bride. And I was sitting probably 15 feet away from this child, next to some people. I have a daughter. This was one of the hardest moments for me. There's nothing, we will talk more about this later in the evening, there was clearly nothing I could do except sit and take notes and watch this thing occur and try not to cry visibly in the tent. Next one. Ceremonial dancing. This is an occasion, you have to understand, of tremendous joy and festivity in this village. And I want to talk about where the joy comes from in a second. Next slide. The girls are being picked up now. You can see that it's getting dark, and they're being carried toward the place where the ceremony, which is going to go on for hours, will take place. Next slide. Now, this picture is the most haunting picture to me that Stephanie took in the entire time that we were there. And I'm going to linger on it just for a minute because I want you to understand why it was so haunting. Rajni had been asleep on a cot. She's 5. By this time, it's like 9, 10 o'clock at night. She's been taking a nap. That's what 5-year-olds do. Her uncle, who's carrying her, picked her up from this cot so gently and so lovingly and put her over his shoulder like this. And it was, I think, at this moment, from all that I had learned, that I began to understand how extraordinarily complex this act was. Back up for a second. What's happening in this village, this is not at all uncommon. The grandfather has arranged the weddings of these 3 girls, and he has done it in a very classic Indian way. One of the things you have to remember is that in Indian culture, regardless of one's caste, whether one is rural or urban, whether one has money or not, it is still the practice for the majority of Indians, despite all the Bollywood glamour and the cleavage and the dresses and the sexy dancing in the movies, it is still the practice for marriage to be arranged by 2 families. The idea that a girl or woman should have some independent right to fall in love with a guy, announce to her parents that they're going to get married and hope her parents are into it, in the American fashion, is regarded in India as just nonsense. What kind of basis is that, they will say, for a lifetime relationship? Marriage is the joining of two families, not some foolishness about people falling in love with each other. And if the two families are joined carefully and thoughtfully, and if the astrological signs meet up, and if the families are really compatible, and if the young man and the young woman will clearly complement each other in terms of their intelligence and their goals in life and so on, and ideally, if they like each other, in many of the more modern families, the two young people meet so that there is some opportunity for them to say, not on your life, I can't stand the guy. Then, if all those things fall into alignment correctly, the marriage will happen. And my husband and I, who were traveling together, became more and more fascinated by the very modern young people we would meet, including at one point the young, very hip man who was helping us with some translation. He was going to go into the military, he spoke excellent English, he knew every Western movie star there is, and he was assuming that his parents would help him get married, because that's what you do. They're smarter than you about this, and of course, you'll fall in love with each other eventually because they've picked the right person for you. That's very important to think about when you think about what's really going on here. So grandfather has picked for Rajni a good family, a farming family, and he's picked for her a family where she'll be living with one of her aunts who's older than she, so she won't be lonely. The guy has a good reputation, and she'll be protected from sexual assault because she's married. And, I'm telling you, this is the complicated part, right? In India, the tradition is that you don't actually go to the home of your new husband until you're at least somewhere near puberty. So theoretically, she's going to live with the grandparents until she's 11 or 12, and then she'll go to her husband. And then they'll have sex when she's ready for it, but not until then. So these people love this child, and they think they are doing the right thing for her. And that was the hardest thing for me to grasp. And, more complication, there's no schooling for this child beyond 5th grade in her village. There's a little school that will take her, kind of, and give her a bad education until then. If she wants to go to middle school in this village, she has to get on a bus crowded with predatory men in this community. She has to travel some distance, and she has to get to a school that may or may not have facilities for her to change, to go to the bathroom in private. Once she starts getting her period, to be able to handle her sanitary needs. That's not going to be there. Are they going to send her to that? No. Not to protect her. In addition, they're going to save what money they have for the boys, because the boys will stay with them, and the girls will go to someone else's family. So they have done the right thing, they believe, by this child. And that's the hardest thing for us to get our heads around. Okay, next slide. This is the ceremony in the middle of the night. The boy, you will note, is only a few years older than she. Presumably, this kid is about, we thought he was about 10. So presumably he has some notion of what's going on. There are two older boys as well who clearly understand what's happening. They're about 16 and about 18. And in India, again, this is the more typical practice. The guy is a good, somewhere between 4 and 8 years older. Next slide. This is the newlywed couple, right? It's about 2 o'clock in the morning. She still doesn't have a clue. You can see the look on his face, like, oh God, what am I doing here? Next slide. This is a different young woman. She's on her way to a wedding, and she's terribly distraught. This is the same woman that you saw, same girl, she's not a woman yet, that you saw in the video, who had her head back and was wailing. This was an event that Stephanie attended, also in India. Next slide, please. Here is another double wedding that we saw, and if you'll go to the next slide, I just want you to look at the faces of both the boys and the girls, the young men and the young women, who are being pulled into this for reasons of family tradition. Next slide, please. This is not a face of someone going happily to her own wedding. Next slide. Here is another couple you can see, and again, when you look at this couple, you need to think about the multiplicity of forces that are ganging up on these kids. One of the things that was the hardest for me to learn, but I finally came to see, is that some of the strongest pressure for these kids to continue their family tradition and the cultural tradition of their community is coming from women, particularly from older women, from grandmothers, because the grandmothers are communicating regularly to the mothers and to the children, look, I did this, I survived, being a woman is tough in society, this is what we do. And I saw several cases of girls who were basically being told, you better do this before I die if you want to honor your ancestors and you want to honor me and not undo everything that I stood for. Next slide. These girls are all wives. They are all Yemeni girls with the child. Next slide, please. This is a discussion underway between, I believe, this is not a village that I was in, but I believe that we're in the process of negotiating here about the marriage. Next slide, please. And again, here, these are the girls who are about to be promised. Next slide, please. Now, I want to start talking to you about some elements of change and hope. These 3 kids in India are watching a soap opera in India. I'm forgetting now the name of the soap opera because I don't speak Hindi, but it's a Hindi soap opera. They're very popular in India, as soap operas are all over the world. And the one that was the most popular when we were there was about child brides. And it was part of the ongoing campaigns that surge regularly through India to try to make kids and families understand through education, through widespread education, how destructive this is. And we saw in villages, like in many developing parts of the world, you can find tremendous poverty, dirt floors, tiny homes, no plumbing, limited water supply, and an electric hookup for a television set. Very typical. And they're fascinated by this show. And the show is filled with messages about the wrongs to a girl, physically and emotionally, of being married and being forced to marry too young. Next slide, please. Okay. This girl is named Sunil. She's, at this point in the picture, she's 12. When she was 10, she lives in another village, quite far from there. When she was 10, she was brought into the ceremony that she thought was just for her older sister one night, and her mother started tying a string around her wrist and telling her, well, guess what? You're part of this too. Now, Sunil lives in a village that has a village worker. There's a type of village worker that they hire all over India. They pay these women a stipend, and their job is to monitor the health, physical and to a certain extent psychological, of families around the village, act as a liaison between them and the health system. This particular worker, they're called Sathins in India, had been following the government campaigns quite closely. She had very enlightened and supportive parents. We met them. She lived right down the, if you want to call it a street, down the dirt alley from this house. And Sunil looked at her parents and said, quote, if you marry me, I will break your heads with a rock, and then I will go to the police. And then she left the house and ran down the street to the Sathin. And the Sathin's family supported her and went to the parents and said, don't do this, it's wrong, and here are all the reasons that it's wrong, and they didn't. And by the time we got to Sunil, she was a cricket batswoman on her team and was in 5th grade. And that's who this kid is. This is a fabulous picture that Stephanie took of Sunil. That's the girl that we met. She's going to go to school, and she's going to be part of the force that keeps the idea spreading in this village. Next slide. Okay, this is my absolute favorite picture of all of them. This girl's name is Nujud Ali. She's very famous in Yemen and in parts of the East. In very short sum, Nujud's story is that about 4 years ago, after her father, in a transaction that was basically to restore some family honor and repay a debt, married her off to an older cousin. Cousins, it's not clear how many years older than Nujud, but Nujud at this time was 10. Cousin promises the father, I won't have sex with her until she's ready. Promise is kept for less than 1 day. Cousin takes Nujud to the village, forces her into sex. The family of the cousin is like, right, this is what's supposed to happen. They hold up the bloodied sheet. Everything is as it's supposed to occur. Nujud, who knows why, decides that she's going to fight back. This is how these things change. Somebody's got something extra, some moxie from who knows where, and Nujud decides she's going to run away. She runs away from the village. She gets back to Sana'a, where her family lives. Her father goes crazy, says, our family will never survive this. You're dishonoring everything. She goes to her father's second wife. Her own mother is just too cowed to do anything about it. She goes to her father's second wife. Her father's second wife, again, who knows why, breaking point, says, I'm giving you money for a taxi. There's a big building in Sana'a called a courthouse. You go there. You tell them your story. She goes to the courthouse in Sana'a alone in her little tiny abaya, 10 years old. That's the long black gown. She is sitting on a bench, and somebody comes up to her and says, what are you doing here, little girl? And she says, I want a divorce. Sana'a goes crazy, basically, over the next month. She finds a lawyer, a woman who has been representing abused women in court. They take her, a judge takes her home, has her play with his kids overnight, right? So she gets to live in a family where kids are treated like kids. And after a tremendous amount of hoopla in Sana'a, she is granted the divorce. And the day she's granted the divorce, the whole courthouse erupts in cheers. She has, since that time, gone back to live with her father, who's been sort of publicly excoriated all over Yemen. Yemen obviously has huge turmoil underway right now that has nothing to do with child marriage. But when we were there, there was a tremendous amount of national argument going on about child marriage, with some saying, yes, it's wrong, but we can't make laws against it. Others saying, the prophet's first wife was a child, it may not be right, but who are we? Others saying the prophet was the prophet, we are not the prophet, it is modern times. A big national debate, in other words, a very serious one, was underway in a country that had never talked about this as common as the practice is, until this little girl went to the courthouse and asked for her divorce. So this is how things will change, and this is the image that I like to keep in my head as I think about where all this may be going. We'll have a lot more questions to talk about as we get up on stage, but those are the images that I wanted to walk you through.
That was amazing, incredible. So we do have a good bit to talk about, and I do want to get you involved in this discussion as well. We have microphones here for those of you that do have questions, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But I want to ask, Cynthia, you mentioned several times about this idea that there are laws, that this is illegal in these countries. How is this not stopped?
Well, it's not illegal in all the countries. It's not, for example, illegal in Yemen. It is illegal in India. And how it's not stopped is a combination of factors. First of all, there's bribery. Second, there is cultural conspiracy, if you will. If you live in the village that Rajni lived in, and you know the story of Rajni's grandfather, and you know that you believe that Rajni's best future to be protected lies in going to this other village with this new husband, and you respect Rajni's grandfather, who has a very good reputation in the village as a thoughtful and protective head man, you don't want to bring disgrace upon that family. You may, and we don't know, have sat down in the back and said, I don't think you should do this, I think there are other ways to protect this child, but you're not going to call the cops, because that would be a horrible thing to do in your village. And that kind of conspiracy to protect cultural practice happens all over the world and in many different contexts, and that's the largest reason that these things go unprosecuted.
Is there also a matter of priorities in these countries, that there are so many issues, so many problems,
Absolutely.
that this just doesn't rank?
Absolutely. What tends to happen, at least in my obviously limited experience of this, is that a particular case will fire people up. And normally, it is the case of a young girl and a much older man. Now, it's important to bear in mind, when you see the large statistics, 25,000 a day and so on, the people who have really made this issue visible, there's a number of organizations around the world, that, including the one that Anju, the woman in Stephanie's video, belongs to. They have a much broader view than just the shocking cases that tend to exercise people, like the little girls with the old men. From their perspective, this is a crime against any young woman, not only for the reasons that come first to our mind about the notion of children being forced into sex, but because this deprives girls of becoming full adults. As Stephanie said in the video, they almost always get pulled out of their educations. It stops right away. They stop becoming productive citizens in their own society. There's a whole host of dreadful physiological problems that are very frequent with early childbirth, most notably something called fistula, which some of you in global health may have studied, which I don't want to go into the gamey detail of fistula, but it basically renders a girl horrible with all kinds of dreadful discharges for the rest of her life unless it's fixed. And it comes from having a child before your body is physically ready to do it, tears that take place inside. So these organizations work against the practice of marrying kids off under the age of 18 all over the place. And if you think about that, we have societies here where it's very common for girls to marry at 16 or to have children at 16 and then cut off their own futures.
John, at the Pulitzer Center, this obviously was a story that you guys felt very strongly about supporting. Help us understand how this fits into the broader spectrum of what the Pulitzer Center is trying to do in supporting stories like this, particularly when it involves women's rights, women's health.
Well, the Pulitzer Center has supported a number of projects on women and children in crisis, and we've done half a dozen or so in the last 2 years alone on maternal mortality. And in the course of doing that work, we were made more conscious of the issues that Cynthia has just mentioned, particularly young marriages leading to births too soon and physiological damage. In terms of the specific project, I mean, it's a good example in a way to me of the role that the Pulitzer Center has played and the importance of finding support for these kinds of stories. This was a story the National Geographic was already doing, and Stephanie had been working on it for many, many years. And when she came to us, it was that she was shy $10,000 to do a multimedia piece that would help bring further to life this story. And so it was like so many of the proposals that come to us, it was not a difficult decision. When we saw the work, we read the story, we knew what was coming in National Geographic, and luckily we had resources. We had raised enough money that we could put them into helping this video be produced, and because the money was available, we were able to produce that, and thanks to Stephanie and Pamela Chen and others, in 6 or 7 weeks, and then we've used it in multiple venues, and of course on the web it's been important, but it's a way that opens up the issue and hopefully brings people to read Cynthia's remarkable story and to find out more about child marriage and other issues, similar issues, and that's what we see as our role.
So tell us just a few more of these kinds of projects that would connect to this and the role that the Pulitzer Center is playing in multiplying the ability for this story to get out in more venues than just one magazine.
Well, we've done a number of collaborations. We did some of you here tonight may have been with us last summer when we put on Voices of Haiti, which was a multimedia video poetry project that was produced for the National Black Theater Festival. And there we commissioned Kwame Dawes, a poet who was then the English professor at University of South Carolina, to go and do a series of trips to Haiti after the earthquake to spend time with people affected by HIV/AIDS. And we also sent photographer Andre Lambertson and videographers and others to work with him. We eventually commissioned music to go with it, and that led to pieces that were featured on NewsHour and the Washington Post and USA Today, and it was an unconventional approach to journalism, but it was our view that it was a way to keep sustained attention on a place like Haiti, and at the same time we were able to commission half a dozen other projects looking at everything from environment to education to healthcare in general in Haiti, and made that part of the same collaborative series of stories with NewsHour and USA Today, and hopefully then bring people to the website to get the deeper information about the project. And that's the kind of this approach that we take on all of our projects. Is that, you know, what can we do? What are the many ways that we can amplify this story, bring in other partners, bring in whether it's university partners or NGOs or journalists from different platforms. And one of the great optimistic things about what is happening in journalism today is because of the kind of economic collapse of the old commercial for-profit journalism model, is that news organizations that 10 years ago would never have thought of collaborating are open to that today, and because they see that there's more power in cross-promotion with other organizations, a newspaper collaborating with a television and so on, and so we've worked to do more of those.
That's great. Cynthia, I want to bring you back into this, and there was an issue that came up throughout the story and throughout your talk, really, where you talked a lot about religion, that this wasn't about religion, that it's not a religious ritual or a religious trait. But you make the point of quoting someone from Yemen of saying, something that Allah did not forbid, we cannot forbid, and that the Holy Quran contains no specific age restrictions when it comes to marriage. How did that inform your reporting? How did that inform your sense of your reaction to this story and what you needed to do with it?
Well, it's a really interesting question because there's one. Originally, it was conceived in terms of reporting as a project that would span 3 continents. And I was to go to either Ethiopia or Senegal to report on the African parts of it. And I was the one who said, oh my Lord, we have so much already with India and Yemen. I can't figure out how we could possibly put an entire new continent into this story. I'm sad about that for one reason. I mean, we all would have gone nuts trying to figure out how to get it in there. But to an extent that I wish were not the case, people ended up feeling that this was in some way an attack on Islam or an attack particularly on Hindu practice. And that's not the case. Because as I said when we were talking, as Stephanie says in the film, and as I said in passing, but not in enough detail in the article, this is a traditional practice that comes from culture. It would take a deeper academic thinker than I to define the differences between cultural tradition and religious tradition in many communities. As we know, we've all experienced this, they are deeply intertwined, right? For all of our grandparents or great-grandparents, what did they practice because their religious faith told them to do, and what did they practice because the people with whom they shared their religious faith always did that? I used to have these arguments with my Jewish grandmother, and she couldn't tell you. So these are very difficult questions, and in each of the communities in which this happens, there is some element of justifying this practice because our people who are, fill in the blank, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Mormon, have always done this. Nonetheless, it's not part of the practice of the teaching of the religious faith. Now, in Yemen in particular, where there was a big argument underway, as I've mentioned, about whether to incorporate an age limit into the law, the religious argument that was going on was really fascinating about it. I make no pretense to being a scholar of Islamic teaching, but for example, people who were against putting a limit, you couldn't find anybody in Yemen to say, I think it's good to marry 13-year-olds to older men. No one would say that publicly, and I think it's hard to find someone to really articulate that position despite people doing it. But those who would say we shouldn't have a legal prohibition, like this conservative cleric I quote in the article, would say, look, the Prophet's favorite wife, Ayesha, was very young when they married. Then there's a whole alternate scholarly, religious, historical argument that says, no, Ayesha wasn't actually that young. If you look at all the different signs and you interpret the text properly, she was actually more like 17. And anyway, it doesn't matter because we're in a new era right now. So again, what we're really talking about is a use of, I believe, religious teaching to justify a practice that has been prevalent in certain communities and has been convenient for certain communities for a long time.
So you take it in the context. You're preparing for this story. I had the opportunity to meet Stephanie Sinclair in Boston last fall, and Cynthia at that time. These are fearless women, fearless journalists, very strong individuals. And you head off into these societies as women, professionals, that aren't necessarily well regarded for being women or being professionals. And you pull the story off. How do you make that transformation?
Well, there's a couple of things. One is that it is my experience of doing quite a bit of travel in, third world is kind of an old-fashioned term. I'm going to say developing countries, countries that are not ours, that reporters are kind of regarded as a third gender. They don't know what to make of you. That's one thing, and that's sort of cross-nation, I've found. The other thing, I was telling one of the classes I spoke to this morning, amusingly, actually it was in Rajni's village. When I first got there, we first got there during the day, 2 days before the wedding was supposed to take place. And the headman in the next village was unusually courteous. It's not that they were discourteous. He was unusually warm toward me, shook my hand, very unusual. Actually kind of didn't exactly put his arm around me, but kind of said, you know, come over here, kind of patted me on the back to show me something in the village. I thought, well, this is odd. This is not a normal practice, but I was fine. And we'd been together. He'd been showing me around with the interpreter right there, of course, for about 45 minutes when suddenly this look of horror came over his face. And he said something, and I realized he had just figured out that I was a woman. I have short hair. I was wearing pants and a shirt. You know, I'm not very curvaceous. He had never seen a woman who looked like me. And of course, this man, who must have been in his 60s, was mortified. And he was mortified not because he had somehow defiled himself by touching me. He was mortified that he had broken so many social codes by shaking my hand, by approaching me, by narrowing the space between us. And he apologized profusely. And of course, it was a very odd moment, right? And I kept saying, no, it's fine, I'm sorry, I should have. And then I thought, what? I don't know. So finally, we made light of it. And of course, I kept a greater distance. And when I came back to the village the next day, you bet I was wearing a skirt. And I went over to meet him and said, you know, look, we laughed. So that was a fairly typical, another example of this. Stephanie also, I mean, Stephanie and I are both pretty tough-looking gals. What can I tell you? This is what we do for a living. And Stephanie, of course, was also, who was in pants and carrying her photographic equipment, who had not had this mix-up with the man simply because she had been in a different place. At one point, as the evening wore on, the evening of the wedding itself was a very long, difficult evening. We were emotionally drained. There was an elaborate bit of negotiation about whether Stephanie would be allowed to make pictures. Had we brought enough respectful presents to the wedding? Were we trustworthy in terms of not identifying the village because of the illegality and so on? All of this was negotiated with help from our very able translator. And at one point in the course of the evening, Stephanie tripped. It's very dark, right? It's late night. By this time, it's like 10:30 at night. She tripped on a rock, and she fell hard, and she smashed her knee. I mean, it was bloody, and I could tell. I've done knees. They hurt, right? Her face went white, and I took a look at it and said, Stephanie, we got to get you in a car. We got to take you to a clinic. Nearest clinic was like an hour away. She said, no way. She actually said, no blankety blank way. This is Stephanie, right? I said, you're going to pass out. She said, I am not going to pass out. I am getting these pictures. And for the next 2 hours, she literally dragged that leg behind her. And at some point, I think it's pretty clear that the men, particularly of the community, realized what was going on. And there, you could see a kind of shift happening where they were like, I don't really know what that is, but it's tough, right? And that's how we worked, basically. It's just, and it's not like they brought her into their inner confidence, but she was able to approach the wedding fires. And it's fascinating watching someone like Stephanie work, because at the same time that she's phenomenally tough in this way I've just told you, she's also unbelievably tender and gentle with her photographic subjects, which is, of course, how she gets those amazing images. Imagine the kind of confidence you have to inspire to be able to come that close to girls who are in this awful emotional state. And she has this remarkable ability just to go quiet and wait, which is what she's doing, I'm sure, right now in Yemen.
So I want to bring John back into this, and if there are those of you that have questions, if you could just line up behind the microphones here, and we're going to start taking a couple questions. We're going to go about another 15 or 20 minutes before we wrap this up. John, you were a foreign correspondent for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch for a number of years, obviously male, going into lots of different countries. When you hear Stephanie and Cynthia tell their stories about not only getting the story, but having to sort of work with gender issues, help us understand, did you have that perspective as a male that it was different for you to pursue some of these stories in some of these countries?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a whole lot easier to be an honorary man than to be an honorary woman. And in my reporting, I did a lot of reporting in the early 2000s in predominantly Muslim countries in the Middle East and Sudan and elsewhere, and it was almost impossible as a male reporter to cross that divide to where women would really open up to you. Sort of professional women, yes, some westernized, but of course that's not who you were trying to talk to. You were trying to reach people who were part of the society as it was, and that you just couldn't do. You had to be a woman to do that kind of reporting. I had a similar experience in South Africa years ago, and it can work the other way, where this was in the early 90s, in 90 and 94, I made 2 long trips to South Africa at the time that apartheid was under challenge and crumbling, and then during the first elections. And I had the great good fortune of doing those long trips through South Africa. They were each about 5-6 weeks, with a photographer named Odell Mitchell, who was a photographer at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, from East St. Louis, African American, as big as I am, and darker skinned than most Africans. And the two of us were able to have access anywhere. It was amazing, because we'd go into a township and people would assume that he was African, and they'd be sort of hostile toward me, and Odell would open his mouth, and he had this wonderful southern drawl, and suddenly there'd be 150 people around us, and they were our best friends. I just went, who the hell is that guy? And so it depends. There are different ways to sort of break through those kind of cultural barriers.
Yeah, and I wanted just to confirm what he said. There are a number of ways in which obviously being a woman was enormously helpful to me in talking to these girls. And there were places, just as he says, that I was able to go. In Yemen, I wore an abaya and covered my head, not because I was trying to pass, but because it made me feel less conspicuous. And one of the things I learned, having never been in an abaya wearing culture before, is that one of the signs of intimacy between women, okay, the guys are gone, we're going to talk, is to remove the head cover. And it's a physical act. Women have their own, we women, when we're together, have our own ways of sort of doing this kind of symbolically, but they do it literally. And so by doing that, I was able to develop, along with my interpreter, just as John says, a closeness in hearing these girls' stories that I think it would have been impossible for a man to get.
Over here, let's have your question. Tell us who you are, please.
Hi, my name is Putri, and I'm a senior at Wake Forest. My question is, where does the boundary lie to distinguish when one needs to be culturally relativistic and when it actually violates human rights? And also as a follow-up, according to whose standard is the basic human rights established without being Western-centric or Orientalist in that matter?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. It's super important. And we grappled with it all the time, as reporters ought to always, right, when they're traveling. Whenever I am abroad, or even in other states that are not like my weird little Northern California community in which I live, I think a lot about that. And there is, as I'm sure you know, there is no single answer to it beyond tremendous awareness of that problem. I think there is and these are parts of the reasons that bodies like the United Nations and international organizations try to come together to come up with things like universal declarations of human rights, with exactly that question in mind. What is Westernism? What is somehow so universal that it's worth imposing on cultures that don't do it? We have, for example, come to a universal conclusion as human beings that slavery, the owning of another person, is universally wrong whether your culture teaches it or not. And I think that, mercifully, this notion that a young woman, who knows where the age cutoff is, right? Is it 14? Is it 16? Is it 18? That a young woman has a right not to be forced into marriage and or forced into a sexual relationship before she's old enough to make that decision for herself. I think there is a growing acceptance that that also is a universal human right, even if your culture teaches otherwise. But I think you have to keep asking that question over and over.
And I think also you have to be, very humble about where we are as a society.
Yes.
I think when you have these conversations in places like Yemen, and we are sort of outraged, and we can't grasp the practice. I mean, they'll look at us and they say, well, maybe they have access to television, they have access to news about the United States, and they say, what are you talking about? I mean, look at the rates of unwed pregnancies in the United States, and young women who are also pregnant at early ages but have no benefit of marriage or families coming together.
Yeah, I had a conservative cleric say to me, basically, how can you criticize this practice when in your society girls are sexualized by the time they're 12 and 13 years old, and you have high rates of prostitution and pornography? By putting these girls into marriage situations, we're protecting them. Now, I have a lot of problem with this logic, but I don't have a problem with his willingness to look at what's wrong with the way we do things as well.
Hey there, my name's Megan. I'm also a senior here. First off, thank you guys for coming so much. I remember reading this story in National Geographic, so it's really nice to kind of have it come alive with you here today. But my question kind of centers on some popular development theories now that promote the idea of education as a vehicle out of these kind of situations for a lot of young girls. So I just wondered if you could comment on that a little bit. Did you travel into places that education was popular, or did you stick to kind of more rural areas to get these really powerful pictures? And do you think that that's the moxie that is necessary to kind of spread to get these females out of these situations?
Yeah, I think that there's insofar as there's any kind of widespread consensus, as the video indicated, on how you start reversing this, it has to do with education. It has to do both with the education of the girls themselves, because if you look at every single indicator across the board, and for any of you who have read Nicholas Kristof and Shirley Wu Dunn's book, Half the Sky, which I recommend to you, it's really excellent, you'll see that they prove this over and over again in multiple societies. The longer you keep girls in school, the greater the chance that they are going to postpone their childbearing and their marriage years until it's appropriate for them. They're physically mature, emotionally mature, and can figure out where they're going to be in the world. That's number one. Second is, one of the single most effective strategies against both child marriage and genital cutting comes from an organization that's based in Senegal called Tostan, which is a mostly Senegalese organization with a couple of Americans also involved in it, that has developed the practice of going community by community and getting the local communities themselves to agree, I think with a physical signing of a document finally, that as a community they will not allow their girls to be genitally cut nor married very early. And what that does is it educates a whole community, but very important to remember in terms of genital cutting as well, it also makes it clear to a parent that if you don't put your daughter in this practice, you're not isolating her and keeping her from ever being married. Because the reason that genital cutting occurs, even among loving families, is a parent says, if I don't do this to my child's not going to be able to get married. My child will be rejected from the community. So if you've got a whole group of people doing it, you've reduced that risk very greatly. So yeah, education.
Just 2 quick points on that. One, Cynthia did this is another collaboration that we had with National Geographic and NewsHour. Cynthia did a piece on girl power in Brazil, which is a wonderful piece in National Geographic, and then we did a NewsHour report by Fred de Sam Lazaro that was a complement to that and touches on just that issue, the importance of education. And then on the female genital cutting, we just in the last 2 weeks, we had a really extraordinary series of events on a project that we're doing on reproductive health issues in Africa, where we've recruited 4 African journalists to work with international, for the most part American journalists, to try to raise their voices and empower them within their own community and also make them voices on issues like this in the international community. And there's a young reporter, May Azango in Liberia, who did a report that came out 2 weeks ago in Front Page Africa on female genital cutting and the traditional education groups called Sande that practice this among young girls in Liberia. And she published the story on the front page of this newspaper. It caused a tremendous uproar 2 weeks ago, so much so that in Monrovia that there were death threats against her, and she went into hiding. And the member of our staff who was working with her that week, and the Gina Moore, the international reporter working with her, they were helping to hide May during that week. And so we were very concerned about what was going on. The Committee for the Protection of Journalists put out a statement in defense of her. And yet, as the days passed, there was more and more discussion about what this meant and why was it that Liberia had made this such a taboo subject, even though it's a country that had Ellen Johnson Sirleaf as the continent's first woman president. So then just this past week, the government announced that they are now actively going to shut down that Sande group to try to combat female genital cutting. So it was to us a remarkable example of just sort of getting people. It was like the story from Yemen of the 11-year-old who says, "I want a divorce." That somebody stands up and starts talking about an issue, and remarkable things can happen.
First of all, my name is Gary Roberts, and I live here in Winston-Salem. And Cynthia, first of all, thank you so much to you and Stephanie for exposing this horrific practice. So it's just thank you very much for putting your life on the lines. Seeing that the Prophet Muhammad had multiple wives, I think maybe up to 11 wives, and I think his youngest was maybe Aisha. From what I have heard from my limited study of Islam, was 9 years old when they married. Not sure how when they consummated that, and knowing that this is a predominantly Muslim issue, not completely by any means, but predominantly in some of these communities. Knowing that Wake Forest has a Muslim imam on staff, and have you seen any growing anger, desire to Muslim response to this as far as it seems like you're touching on that there has been. And
absolutely, yeah. I mean, the first thing, I do want to correct one thing you said about it being a predominantly Muslim issue. I mean, there are Muslim societies in which this occurs, and as we said, it's still widespread practice among Hindu societies. So it really varies from country to country and region to region, rather than religion to religion. That said, some of the most active campaigning and the most fearless campaigning that I encountered was taking place in Yemen by Yemenis. So when I talked to Yemeni devout Muslim physicians and community workers, and the guy who roared up on a motorcycle and took me to the village in Yemen where we were led into a group of women, he was furious about this. And it's very important to bear. This is not something where somehow, enlightened non-Muslims have come in to correct the Muslims by any means. This is a roaring debate that's taking place within that community, as we have done similarly in ours. And I think there's a tremendous amount of leadership that's coming from there.
Thank you so much. One other ray of hope is Wellspring International. Ravi Zacharias, who was born in India, his daughter Naomi has started this Wellspring International. It's a great, thank you.
We need to start wrapping this up in a minute. I want to just say that we're going to be having a reception afterwards in the lobby upstairs. So we don't get to all of your questions. Please seek out John and Cynthia afterwards and ask them then. I do want to just take a moment and ask Cynthia another question that has been on my mind really since I heard her talk in November. As a journalist, you get into a story like this, and there are lines. There are lines that we as journalists are taught not to cross, that you stay neutral, you stay objective. And this was a very personal thing. You're a mother of 2 children. Right. You saw these children in such danger. How do you not cross that line?
Is that the Almighty intervening in your question? Neutral would not apply here. And it's a word that I try not to use in my reporting. What I try to think of my reporting as not being objective or neutral, but rather being as fair as I can make it. Which is to say, I really work hard to try to listen to as many conflicting voices as I can so that I can understand why people in collision believe as they do and do what they do. There was nothing neutral about my view. I learned how complicated it was, but I never thought it was okay by any measure. Now, in terms of the line, the biggest question you have is, I mean, look at that little girl, right? Anybody here would have had the same impulse that I did, which is to grab that kid, sling her over your shoulder, and run out of the village. Punch every adult out and say, just make this stop. But then you have to stop and think, what happens when you get out of the village? You know? Not only are you suddenly there with a 5-year-old child, which is okay, I'll take her home and I'll raise her, and I'll send her to Wake Forest University, and she'll be an American. This is not what she wants, right? So if you take that child out of her community in any way beyond the gentle, educated manner, you have ripped everything that she is away from her. These are cultures where, to an extent, I think it's hard, even for us who are as close as we can possibly be to our families, to imagine. Your family, your culture, your village is everything. That is your world, even as you go on, ideally, and get an education. You can't rip that away from a girl and expect that you've saved her from anything. So that's what becomes hardest. And thinking about that and the difficulty, the delicacy of trying to change this situation without fully extracting people was the hardest part for us. Now, we got involved, finally. I mean, I crossed a line that I've never crossed before in a story. There was a girl that I didn't talk about tonight that I met in a boarding school. And by the way, parenthetically, if you, in thinking about this and in walking away, feel agitated and moved to pursue the issue further or figure out if there's somebody you can donate to or somebody you can write a letter to, if you look for the story on the web, which is very easy, you just go National Geographic Child Brides and it'll pop right up. You'll see if you look at the text that there's a thing on the side called How to Help. And what we did simply was locate several of the organizations that we thought were really effective and put contact info in there. One of those organizations pulls girls out of the villages in northern India and sends them to boarding school so they'll at least get a high school education. We met an astonishing young woman there, just really smart, very together, who'd been married when she was 8. And she was 17 by the time I met her. She taught me a lot. She brought me out to her village. And when we got back, we sort of became very close, even though we had to work through an interpreter. The interpreter became a good friend to her, too. When my husband and I got back from India, she sent us an email saying, I'm running out of school, and they're going to make me go live with this guy that I got married to, and we knew this was going to be a disaster. He was utterly uneducated. She now had a high school education. The only way I can put this off for another year until I'm 18 is by continuing to go to school, but this program doesn't support post-high school. The people who ran the program, who we knew were very good and reputable people, said, she's right. We don't have a fund for post-high school. And this is a situation we're now starting to run into because girls are finishing the program. And they said, will you do it? And I thought, oh my Lord, because I'd never been in a situation like this. I thought if the National Geographic starts helping out every desperate person that we interview, this is a bad precedent. But to my surprise, the Geographic said, no, if you want to do it, we'll support you in this. And so, for the first time in the stuff I've been doing, I said, you know, it was a very tough balancing. I was like, here are all the reasons not to do it. Getting involved, you're part of the story now, et cetera, et cetera. Here are the reasons to do it. I like these reasons better. Let's just do it. It was really that rational a decision. You know, it was the same years and years ago when my husband and I were working together as journalists. We were in the Amazon, in the gold country, in a tiny village made out of straw, literally, along the sides of the banks of a river. Writing, covering, he was taking pictures, I was writing. And a fire broke out in the village. Now you can imagine what happens if you're it's a town literally made out of straw and a fire breaks out. Very bad situation. And it's an improvised town. And there was a split-second moment there where we looked at each other and we were like, do we join the bucket brigade or do we take notes? Now, he's a photographer. He took pictures. He took some fantastic pictures. I put my notebook down and joined the bucket brigade, right? If I'd been a photographer, if I'd been Stephanie, I probably would have gone on taking pictures too. So taking care of Shobha for a year was joining the bucket brigade. And you're going to have to ask me sort of episode by episode where that line is for me. But it's there somewhere, and I think about it all the time.
I think in that there's a ray of hope. There's a hope that there are journalists like Cynthia who will put their heart into things like this, not just their mind, their energy, their creativity, all that. It's really remarkable. We have to stop now. There's another group that needs to come into this room in about 30 minutes. So I'm afraid we're not going to be able to get to these questions. I really want you, though, to ask them afterwards. I want to thank President Hatch for hosting us here tonight, for all of you for coming out. It's really extraordinary to support this event. And of course to John Sawyer, Cynthia Gorney for such an extraordinary program. Thank you all very much.